Good morning, everyone. I'm Saadia Zahidi. I'm a Senior Director at the World Economic Forum. I head the forum's Women Leaders and Gender Parity program. The program essentially aims to do three things. One, research, measurement, because what we can measure, we can address. Within that portfolio, we try to measure the annual gender gap in over 130 countries. We look at the corporate gender gap, we look at specific countries, we look at specific industries. Second, we try to engage leaders, influential leaders from across the world, business leaders, civil society leaders, government leaders, into actually trying to narrow the gender gap. And then finally, third, we try to work on the forum's own diversity practices, the forum's own activities, and try to ensure that more women are present at the table, whether it's at Davos or at our other activities. Well, today I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the annual Global Gender Gap Report. First, why are we really trying to create this index? I think we all intuitively know that no country in the world has closed the gender gap, but there are a number of differences across countries, and those are the differences that we're trying to capture through this index. The index has four principal features. First, it's looking at gaps rather than levels. So for example, we're not trying to tell a country such as Pakistan that it has lower levels of education as compared to a country such as Sweden. That's probably the case for both women and men because it's a lower income country compared to a higher income country. What we're trying to tell countries is what is the relative gap between women and men as compared to in other countries. So for example, what's the relative gap between women and men in Pakistan as compared to Bangladesh? That's a more meaningful comparison. Second, we're trying to look at outcome factors rather than enabling factors or policy factors. So for example, we would look in the index at labor force participation, but we would not try to look at, for example, the number of weeks of maternity leave that are being allowed in a particular country, because that's a policy factor. So we're purely trying to look at outcomes. Third, the index is rewarding parity rather than attempting to give extra points to those countries where there are reverse gender gaps. So we reward up to parity, but don't give any extra points to countries, for example, such as Sweden, that have 1.5 women for every man in university. That country would not get any extra points over a country that has a parity ratio. And then finally, fourth, we're trying to produce an index that is really comparable over time. And relative to inequality benchmarks. So 0 on this index means perfect inequality, 1 means perfect equality. And what we're trying to capture is how is a country moving up or down over time within that benchmark. The Global Gender Gap Index has 4 sub-indices. 1, health and survival, 2, educational attainment, 3, economic participation opportunity, and 4, political empowerment. The index is composed of 14 indicators. 13 are from hard data sources, and 1 comes from a survey that's conducted by the World Economic Forum. Now, what do we know about the rankings for this year? I'm going to try to give you an overview of where we stand near the top of the rankings, where we are towards the bottom, and then point out a few interesting countries. So the index scale, which is between 0 and 1, can roughly be interpreted as a percentage. So if a country gets a score of 0.75, it essentially means that that country has closed about 75% of its gender gap. At the very top of the rankings is Iceland, and Iceland has a score of 0.85. So even the highest ranking country in the world has only closed about 85% of its gender gap and still has to close about 15% of that gap. So no country in the world has really reached parity. At the very bottom of the rankings is Yemen, and Yemen has closed about 47% of its gender gap. So women in Yemen essentially have less than half of the resources and opportunities that men have. If we take a look at the rankings overall, towards the very top are the Nordic countries. They tend to do well in most indices. In this particular case, it's interesting that they still come out near the top because the index is disassociated from the level of development or the level of income of a country. What we're really trying to capture is how equitably are resources and opportunities being distributed between women and men in any country, regardless of the overall level of those resources and opportunities, and still the Nordic countries come out near the top. However, because this is the methodology that we are using, we also find lower income countries or emerging markets near the top of the rankings. So for example, Lesotho, Philippines, and South Africa are all in the top 20 of the rankings, because although they are lower income countries, they are doing a better job at the distribution of opportunities between women and men. The United States is in 17th position, and Mexico, where you are, is in 89th position out of the 135 countries that we've covered this year. Brazil is in 82nd position and Saudi Arabia in 131st. You should be able to download the full rankings from the World Economic Forum website. So what do we know about the world as a whole? What we can tell from the 135 countries that we've captured, which represent about 93% of the world's population, is that by and large the world is doing fairly well in terms of health and education. So 96% of health gaps have been closed, 93% of education gaps have been closed. However, when we take a look at economic participation, only about 60% of that gap has been closed, and in terms of political empowerment, less than 20%. So while women are starting to be almost as healthy and almost as educated as men, they're still not as present in terms of economic participation, and certainly not in terms of political decision making. This is essentially a waste of human capital. So is there any good news? Are we seeing progress over time? And in the 6 years that we've been producing the Global Gender Gap Report, we're actually able to report on some fairly positive trends. So first, 85% of the countries that are covered have actually made progress in the last 6 years. 15% have started to fall behind. Out of those that have made progress, some have started out very low. So countries such as Saudi Arabia, countries such as the United Arab Emirates, they've started out very low in the rankings, but are amongst the fastest movers in terms of the change that has taken place in the last 6 years. If countries do not empower, educate, train, and integrate into the economy that one half, they're going to undermine their own competitive potential over the long term. So while there's a very clear equity argument to be made in terms of women and men's equality, there's also an efficiency argument to be made. Countries and companies that don't utilize the full talent that's available to them are going to undermine their own growth and competitiveness. I hope that some of the ideas that you will be generating over the next 2 days will be useful to helping close this gap, and please do send through those ideas to me. I'd love to hear from you.